This is our opportunity to talk to Julia, the author of Fully Connected, Julia Hobsbawm, for those of you who want to know her last name. She is a bit of paper you gave me. I saw this project. This is a book, Fully Connected, which came out earlier this year. I've seen this project from an early point. Julia and I are old friends, and I read a number of the versions. It got better and better. It's a really great book. For those of you who haven't read it, I strongly suggest you do read it. Buy it, of course. Don't steal. It's been nominated for... Julia?
Management Book of the Year.
Management Book of the Year, which is quite a compliment, big deal. Lots of great reviews. Julia, I think, what is this, your 100th speech of the year?
Yeah.
100th appearance of the year.
Yeah.
So she's nailed something important, surviving and thriving in an age of overload. It's a book which is also a narrative, a personal narrative, a kind of autobiography of her experience with being overloaded, with being too fully connected in our digital age. So to kick things off, I thought Julia might just talk briefly about 2 or 3 things. Firstly, why she wrote the book. Secondly, what the book is about. And perhaps most importantly, because I don't think there'll be anyone here who would argue that there are problems with being too fully connected in our digital age, but what we're going to do about it. So, Julia, over to you.
Thank you. Can I have my book? I might even read a tiny little bit from it.
You've only got 1 copy.
Well, it's my, my lucky copy that's been scribbled on. Thank you. It's really good to be here. So I have written about modern connectedness and its discontents. I suppose the book is an attempt, and some of the stuff I talk about and broadcast about is the idea that we have slightly swallowed wholesale a culture, a Kool-Aid that says modern connectedness is just marvelous and groovy and emancipating. And whilst it has many of those aspects, and I'm as digitally addicted and connected as the next person, possibly more so, I nevertheless recognize that this hyper-connected era carries with it discontents. And I wanted to explore that and bring that into the conversation, really, because I thought it was unhealthy not to. And I suppose I just want to start by reading a tiny little bit from the beginning of the book that places in context the fact that we are, at a very, very recent moment in history. Now, which bit shall I read to you? Okay, I was born in 1964 in London's Bloomsbury, around the time that Gordon E. Moore, the founder of Intel, framed Moore's law, that computing capacity would double every 2 years. This was also just a handful of years before the psychologist Stanley Milgram undertook a landmark study looking at just how short the connection paths were between people. The answer famously was 6, hence 6 degrees of separation, which we all instinctively know and understand, ironically, to mean the opposite. Rather than how separate or disconnected we are, the experiment showed just how connected we are to everyone by only 6 removes. In a small world, and this experiment was called Small World Theory, connections are limited. Now, of course, they're not. Twitter, Ebola, Zika, airlines, take your pick. We may still live and work and operate in small clusters, but we reach many, many others. And nowadays, we reach them very quickly indeed. And the management writer Francis Cairncross calls this the death of distance, that what you've experienced in a very short period of time is the actual shrinking of physical distance of the computer and the technology and the infrastructures on which we lived to literally an embedded state. And I think the physics of that, what Sandy Pentland at MIT actually calls the social physics, but I think the hardcore physics of that space and dimension and speed at which information travels, and the fact that we all now live with a smartphone in our hand, and by this time next year, almost all of us will know somebody who has an embedded sensor of some kind. This is a big deal, and to say it's not a big deal, and to say that the human doesn't need a sort of corrective.
Hold on, wait, you said next year all of us will know someone who has an embedded sensor.
Well, for health, for diabetes, for the, it's absolutely.
How many of you have embedded sensors? How many of you know someone with an embedded sensor? Okay, so.
Well, and it's interesting that, you see, what's interesting about this is that the speed is exponential. So anyone who heard me yesterday would say Moore's law, in principle anyway, ran out last year because the computing capacity is so fast and so nano that it sort of ran out and expired. The acceleration is mind-boggling. You're shaking your head. I know it's a... Right. But the point is, in 2015, there were 1 billion people on Facebook in the same day, and there were 2 billion by 2016. So it's entirely possible that the people in this room will know people.
So tell everyone the narrative, because I think that one of the most interesting bits of the book is the story of how you had a kind of connectivity breakdown.
Well, I got sick 10 years ago. I got sick. I was actually, my moment of awareness came at a terribly posh event at Clarence House with the Prince of Wales. And I was organising a little thing, charity thing. And I met a very handsome, sorry, because my husband is in the audience, but he is kind of legendarily handsome, member of the aristocracy called Zach Goldsmith. And he is educated at Eton and he's fantastically polite. And so there I am in this very elite gathering. I'm about to go on holiday. And as I speak to him, I drop the most disgusting tissue full of, you know, bad cold on the carpet. And because he's really well brought up, he picks it up like it's sort of a lotus leaf and he hands it back to me. And in that moment, I thought, what's going on? What am I doing? Bringing kind of I'm ill. And I hadn't really understood that. And then a couple of weeks later, we went on holiday, which is, of course, legendarily when people collapse. And I did, I collapsed. And I had pneumonia and septicemia. And as I recovered, I just became interested in that holistic balance between stress, illness, overload. And I realized that I felt like I was a hotel that was sort of full to capacity, or 95% full. And I mean, Andrew, let's just ask, who here in this room
Yeah, exactly, I was going to ask the same. How many of you feel
overloaded? Who feels full to capacity?
Who feels overloaded? Who feels as if there are just too many demands, particularly connected with their digital devices?
Okay.
And how many of you feel that you're coping pretty well with it and that you're not bothered, that you think this is a myth?
Oh, wonderful. We can have a really interesting conversation about that.
So why are you here? Convince them, Julia. There are people here who disagree with your thesis. And well, I have to admit that I'm, you know, as some of you know, I'm skeptical of a lot of the digital stuff, but I don't feel overwhelmed either. And I actually think that, in a way, the kind of the new digital elite, people like ourselves, people who come to events like this, it's almost a badge of honor to be slightly to be too connected. If you're not too connected, then you're a failure.
My real issue is not the too busyness and the fact that, you know, some people don't manage their notifications and, you know, don't ever manage their email, which we're kind of on. I mean, I agree with you, that's not a big ask. My problem, and the reason why I use the metaphor of health and what I call social health, is I think there's a big dysfunction going on. And I think two things. One is, you know, by most measures and metrics, the world is not functioning brilliantly. Productivity, I know you can talk about what is productivity, but it's stagnant. Stress levels are soaring. 60% of
Depression.
60% of working days in the EU are lost to stress, and one of the factors of stress is overload. I addressed a bunch of diplomats in the EU in Brussels on Tuesday. They were dealing with security. This was the day that the UK report was published that pretty much showed that the Manchester bomber, and in fact all the terrorist attacks in London this year, were sort of buried in the data. What I spoke about yesterday in the debate was that it's the 30th anniversary of PowerPoint, and that a very interesting moment happened when the Challenger shuttle crashed. It turned out that a PowerPoint presentation had been given at NASA 3 months before, and embedded in that PowerPoint was the data that should have been acted on, wasn't acted on. So the point is, we are missing stuff. We are dysfunctional as a society and as a culture. And I do think that's a problem. And just on the stats, I mean, you know, Ofcom, the media regulator, the last big survey it produced, you know, there's a trebling of time that the 14 to 26-year-olds spend. I mean, we know all this.
Is there a connection between the rise of depression and loneliness and the fact that we, you know, we're obsessively tied to these devices? And social media is, of course, I've made this argument in lots of different books, social media is profoundly unsocial or antisocial.
I think that is true. I mean, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. There's a big psychological review study published just a couple of weeks ago that says there is not necessarily a causation argument, but that there is a relationship between the rise in teenage depression, particularly girls, and the sort of, you know, looking your best on Instagram. Even that doesn't bother me so much as the fact that most of us spend 10,000 days of our lives working, and an awful lot of us hate what we do. And we hate what we do because we're badly managed,
How many of you
organized.
hate what you do? You laugh nervously. One person. How many of you love what you do?
Do you love the management systems? Do you love the HR systems? Hands up who loves HR. Okay, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
of course we love what we, thank you. Of course we love what we do. Those of us with autonomy, those of us driven by creativity, I get that. That's wonderful. We are luxurious. We also have control over our time and, dare I say, budgets. I don't know who paid for you to be at OEB, but it probably wasn't personal. So this is all great. But the majority of people are what I would call marzipan managers, stuck below the leadership icing.
What's a marzipan manager? It sounds disgusting.
It is. They're stuck in the layers. In the layers, reporting to. There's a nod over there. So I kind of, what I'm trying to address is that, really, rather than what a lot of people do want me to talk about, which I'm very happy to talk about, which is how do you switch off and manage technology. But I do feel we're most of us on that already.
So this is a conference about education. Connect this with debates within education. Is education the problem or the solution to this?
Solution to overconnectedness. Well, I think education is one of the areas that is having to reform itself dramatically and drastically, like the corporation, and I think that's good. You know, it seems to me, I'm a visiting academic in a couple of places, so I'm not a full...
You're a professor of connectivity, right?
I'm a visiting professor. In fact, that title's now going to be changed to
professor in social health. How do you teach social health or connectivity?
You can now... I'm actually going to be doing some research. You know, I want to evidence-base some of my theories about the health of connectedness. So my basic position is that the definition of health enshrined by the World Health Organization 70 years ago is the presence of physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of injury and disease. That has spawned a set of behaviors, practices, cultures, a market that's $3.5 trillion, but that the aspect that concerns social, which is our connectedness, doesn't have a narrative, doesn't have an explanation, doesn't have a literacy. There's no gym equivalent, and therefore that could be a problem. what do I think about education? I'm kind of with people like Mark Prensky, who I was debating yesterday, that thinks fundamental reform about the way you treat the individual student has got to be undertaken. So I would say I feel quite radical.
Talk more about that. What needs to happen? And should there be departments of social connectivity or social health in universities?
I think the whole sort of league table ranking, funding mix for education is not necessarily looking in the right direction. I think that
too much pressure on kids.
Pressure, and also the organisations, you know, the metric business. Are you top of the league table? Are you not? Rather than do our kids thrive in the environment of our education? I feel that social health and connectivity should be studied and taught, and that's why I was the first to put my hand up and say, let's look at it and let's think about it. And in fact, I think it is bizarre that it has taken this book to draw together some of the strands of social network analysis, sociology, organizational behavior. It seems to me completely obvious that there should be a collaborative approach to work that's already been done. And my big beef with academia is it often talks to itself. The whole peer review thing is not about saying, how do we communicate what we've learned, what this colleague over here has done, but how do we do more so that we can get whatever it is, grading, and we can get tenure.
How do you teach social health? If you were teaching a course either in school or university on social health, what would you teach?
Well, the first thing you have to do is accept my principle, which is that it is in the same way that physical and to some degree mental health is, if you like, reduced to a triptych of diet, exercise, and nutrition and sleep. I mean, you know, I'm grossly simplifying. I would say that the core components of social health, which is a connected environment that doesn't overwhelm, in which truth can be assessed and trusted, and in which time is not such a starvation that most people feel it's slipping through their fingers. So my belief is that the core ingredients of social health is a balance of managing knowledge, networks, and time, what I call the knot. And how you teach that is how you teach anything else. You use research, you use, you know, hopefully a bit of chutzpah in the classroom, and you demonstrate that these are things to be literate about, and you learn with your students what works and doesn't work.
How can technology help solve this? We can imagine how AI and the Internet of Things and virtual reality could add to the problem of social health, but how can we use these new technologies to solve some of these problems?
Well, I'm a big fan of a lot of what's happened on social networks and the internet, even though the social scientists Rainey and Wellman of the Pew Research Center talk about us being in the middle of a triple revolution of internet, social, and mobile, and that we are at a unique moment. I'm a big fan of both the internet and social media. I certainly couldn't have written my book without the internet, and social media. I love the network effects of social media. I love the spreading of ideas, of information. I quite like the blend, the personal, the professional. All of that I feel is good and a force of positiveness. My main concern is that, a bit like infobesity and obesity, you have to manage excess. And the idea that you don't seems to me naive. And the idea that it's solved by regulation is also not the point. We all take personal responsibility, or ideally we do. And personal responsibility for how we learn and share and trust information versus entertainment versus rumor. And so the network science, as it applies to a particular network structure, which is the internet, is actually interesting and different in dynamic to the network structure of a closed community, like the OEB community is. actually, for a brief period, what is technically called a fully connected network, which is your all nodes connecting back with each other. There's even an app for it. And I don't really understand why people haven't bothered to look at the network science. There's some amazing social network science that should be brought into the boardroom, into the classroom, and that's part of what, to me, makes this stuff interesting. There's a guy in the front itching to take me on here.
Well, let me get a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. There's an interesting movement developing in Silicon Valley of ethical programmers or designers led by a guy called Tristan Harris, who thinks the core problem with this on social health is that the software is being explicitly designed by the Googles and Facebooks of the world to be addictive. Yeah. And in that sense, it's not very different from fast food and from the kind of, from tobacco and these other big industries that have designed products to be addictive in order to be successful. Do you think there's a need for the software industry, and particularly Silicon Valley, to be more ethical in their production of software? Is there a need for a more... you say there's no need for regulation. Well, if it's not regulated, then how else do we force these companies to produce more ethical products?
I'm going to duck that a bit and say I'm more interested in culture than a rules-based. You know, when you look at the health behaviors, since the World Health Organization began, we all wear our healthiness now. That has been, well,
what does that mean, wear?
Okay, so the apparel market, you know, the Nike trainers, the fitness, you know, how we look, we now culturally like to look healthy, and gym wear and fitness wear is literally in the mainstream of fashion. That's one marker that it's become cultural to be fit. And at the moment, it's not yet culturally cool to have social health. And in fact, what I find really distasteful about Silicon Valley is all the techno-evangelists that have made millions and gazillions, and good luck to them, they are the ones that have their kids offline. They are the ones that don't look at the, you know, they've unleashed the beast, and they haven't let everybody in on it.
Final questions before we get to comments from the audience or questions from the audience. Some of you may have emailed Julia. One of the most annoying things when you email Julia is that half the time you get this, especially at the weekend, you get this automated response saying, what is it, you're on?
One of the most annoying. You want to count the ways? Go on.
Well, what do you get at the weekend? You're on?
I'm on a techno Shabbat.
Techno Shabbat, which means...
is basically a secular Jew goes semi-off technology.
So she doesn't do technology at the weekends.
Drives the car, texts, doesn't do the internet.
So talk to us about your own personal regime for social health.
Look, I'm a reluctant fitness freak. You know, when I got pneumonia, I was in my mid-40s. I hated the gym, and I learned what I call in the book pattern management. I'm a little bit of a rebel in the sense I can't stand that thing of you follow somebody else's rules. I can't hack a class. But I began to cherry-pick the ingredients around the gym and found a regime that worked for me. And I feel the same personally is true, and the neuroscience is sort of backing this up. You know, the human brain is not a supercomputer. It does need to switch off and dial down, and the most obvious metric of that is sleep. A third of us, most of us, need to sleep a third of our lives. So all I'm saying is that it is unusual and unhealthy to imagine that we are always on all of the time. I don't think that makes us more engaged, more productive, happier. Hello, waving for the camera as she says that. I mean, I just think it's common sense, but I'm not interested in advocating diet so much as lifestyle. I think it's very important. Who am I to tell you how to manage your technology?
Well, you've written this book. No, you have to. So questions. So let's get to questions from the gentleman at the front, as you say, has been itching. He looks like a socially healthy person. Do you have a question for Julia? Not the photographer, the guy. And then please stick up your hands, because I'm sure we got one here. And then, but keep your no theses. Keep your question. Make sure you ask a question and keep it brief, please, because there's going to be a lot of questions. Her stuff is extremely provocative. This gentleman, and introduce yourself. Tell us who you are.
Okay. Well, Stephen Downs, and My question, because I kept going like this because you kept saying things that I know are false. I'm wondering on what evidence you base assertions like, for example, people haven't thought about connectivity, or people haven't thought about how to manage their digital lives and things like that.
Did I say that? I think that's probably factually incorrect.
People don't study social networks, and I'm thinking, well, Duncan J. Watt,
no, I said
Alfred
people don't see the connection between the existing. There's a huge body of social networks, which I've cited in my book. I mean, by all means debunk what I'm saying, but don't twist what I'm saying. What is your point that disagrees with me?
My point is you said things that were false.
Like?
One thing, and then we're going to move on to Claire.
Like people don't take account of the implications of social networks.
To respond to that, can you pass the thing to Claire, please?
Well, like anything live, if the context in which I've spoken is misunderstood, I would like to apologize. No, I'm the one speaking the words, but, you know, just being hostile about it doesn't really help. I don't think, and the reason why I've written a book, which appears to be landing, is I don't think people generally in the ecosystem are thinking enough about the connectedness and its discontents. And I am trying to bring, through the book, a perspective on that. You're already across it, good for you. But if the point is that somehow I'm spreading falseness, that's a silly point. Forgive me.
And you've hit him hard, which is good. Claire. And introduce yourself.
Julie and I debated, introduced my ideas. Julie and I debated yesterday. Although there's a lot of merit in the book. There's a lot to be said in the book. But anyway, that's one side. One of the things that's bothering me, or if you have a thought on, is a shallowness of networks.
Yeah.
Particularly around politics is what I'm interested in, where everything becomes quantitative. Now, to use a controversial example, hashtag activism, because there's a lot of people who tweet hashtag me too, that's meant to mean that we all nod along with it, even though I think it can turn into a witch hunt. But because it's of the numbers game, it looks as though it's a significant social movement instead of potentially being a fashion. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, because one of the things that struck me, that just as a general thing, is before, you know, if I think about the media in which I work a lot, serious mainstream media organizations, broadsheet newspapers internationally, will tell you that a newspaper article or a magazine article is good because of how many times it's retweeted.
Great
and you
question.
think we've given up on judgment. I mean, this is
Great
a disaster.
question.
Yeah. So. Well,
Other questions? Can you
I agree. I think the metric of speed and scale is problematic. I'm a big advocate of Robin Dunbar, the evolutionary anthropologist who has given us what's called the Dunbar number, that the so-called maximum number of relationships a human can have at any time is 150. I'm interested in the proximity of 150 Dunbar's number to roughly, under 200 functional countries in the world to 168 hours in the week. In other words, small is a different kind of significant. And I agree that the scaled reach alone is not a complete metric. For this reason, I favor companies that use a mix of big data and ethnography, tiny, granular, asking small groups of people what they really feel, because it's those twin data sets of the very large and the very small that I believe give a truer picture. I mean, it's interesting, even in the first question, none of us trust anything anymore.
But Claire's,
and that's partly because of the scale and the speed of the spread of stuff.
But Claire's question, I think, has a bigger, it's not just about quantifiable data. I think, not to put words into Claire's mouth, I wouldn't do that, of course, but that was a joke. I think Claire's question was really about democracy and thinking for oneself. And the implications of her question was that now we have, it's the classic kind of liberal trope, Mill brought it up in the 19th century, that all this connectivity is turning us into sort of sheep.
I would largely agree that groupthink, social proof, you know, Cialdini has done some really interesting work on this area, that the algorithm-led domination of the way information and connectedness is now entwined is a problem, because a retweet becomes a truth, and then the context of that truth, you know, Donald Trump is actually causing havoc as much as anything else via and on and because of Twitter. You know, I sit on a board with the European head of Twitter. I love Twitter. I think Twitter needs to get its act together over Donald Trump. You can't have the president. Yeah, you can't have the president of the United States retweeting hate mail, hate crime, going, "Oh, I didn't know," like no sanction. What's that about?
Anyway, more questions. The gentleman at the back.
Toby Walsh, you suggested that...
Sorry, your name?
Toby Walsh. You suggested that we needed to take responsibility, and regulation wasn't perhaps the part of the answer. But when you hear that Facebook, its new product, is actually targeting children, you start to worry that their motive is not aligned with societal good, and that they do need to, if they're not going to do it themselves, they just need to be regulated.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm ducking that question, but I feel I am more interested in how people take responsibility and create change and movements organically. I'm not saying, you know, but I'm not a legislator, I'm not a politician or a policymaker. I feel personally, at this point in time, I don't want to go there. I'm devoted.
Why?
Because I feel the questions keep being put on to somebody else. We are the driver and engine of our destiny. We can say, I'm not going to be on Facebook. We can say, I am going to behave differently.
We're talking about children, not adults.
Yeah, but, you know, you can take on the whole of advertising. You could run the whole shebang. I just feel that what we need to be focusing on is the behavior that we make on networks. And coming back to the point about understanding a little bit more about the gorgeous, rich plethora of data on networks, is that they themselves are inert. It is the behavior on them that's active. Okay? So the physicist Barabashi, who's worth reading, who wrote a fabulous book called Linked, The Science of Everything, he points out that the internet and a virulent epidemic like Ebola are structurally similar. They are a scale-free network which replicates and replicates and goes out of control. And that's a behavior on a particular network structure. Well, take it up with Barabashi, not with me. And this is not an inaccurate rendition of his scale-free network.
We have a gentleman at the back, right at the back. And please stick up. We've got about 8 minutes left, so if you want to ask Julia a question, stick up your hand. There's one at the front. A gentleman at the back, keep it brief and introduce yourself.
Martin Riemer from Hamburg University.
Oh, sorry, where are you?
He's at the back.
I'm sitting in the very back.
Hello.
I remember times television was going to stop at midnight, and you had natural parts to fall asleep. And it went on 24/7, and we survived it. We managed to cope with it. Same with the British pubs. They were closing at 10. Now they open longer, and we still survive it. And I think with the network, my friends are now available 24/7, and that is quite good, because there are times when I'm actually outside normal opening times or whatever, and I can write something to a friend, and I can read something from a friend. So I think that there's also a good side to it. We only have to learn to cope with it.
Great question. I agree, actually. What do you make of that question, Julie?
Well, I mean, I think that's right. I agree with the idea that we need to look not just at connection, but at disconnection. You know, in the case of the Ebola crisis of 2015, the ex-president Eileen Sirleaf Johnson imposed a quarantine. Quarantine is a disconnection. She cut off.
But his question is that we adapt, Julia, that everyone, you know, it's like the car, every new technology, people say it's going to kill us and ruin us, and we usually adapt.
I think we do adapt, and I think social health is about adapting. I think it's about an awareness. It's about noticing. It's about changing your behaviors. I'm not in any way saying we're stuck. We're not stuck. We're moving on this all the time, and it's great. Progress is being made. But it's like my favorite joke about how many Californian psychoanalysts does it take to change a light bulb? One, but the light bulb has to want to change. You have to notice what's not right.
I'm from California. There aren't psychoanalysts. That's the New York joke. California people don't do that.
I said something untrue. I've always heard of it as
Lady at the front.
Anne-Marie Mathiasen from Denmark. You just actually mentioned it again, the social health. And I'm just wondering, so what is it? Earlier on you mentioned sleep, being offline.
I think social health is a balance of behaviors around knowledge, networks, and time, which is, I think there's too much knowledge swimming around for organizations, companies, individuals to curate actively and effectively. The diet of information is poorer and less diverse than it could be. I think networks, to continue the health analogy, are blocked. For instance, on social networks and intranets and Outlook, friends, strangers, people are not organized about it in the way we are about what goes into our bodies. And I think for professionals, how we manage our time and the challenge of the time that is eaten up on technology, social, professional, 80 different email episodes a day, a piece of research in Australia showed, time needs to be managed. So social health for me is a balance of being online and offline, but also looking at these three core ingredients fundamentally.
Other questions? Anyone else? So final question, Julie, we've got 3 minutes left. You're pioneering the idea of social health. You've written this important book. You've got the ball rolling. Clearly, it's an extremely controversial subject. You've had a great deal of success with this book in 2017. What does 2018 offer? Are you going to do a follow-up? What's the next chapter in this book and in the narrative about social health? Where do you want to take it? And how perhaps can some people in the audience work with you? Maybe there's an institute, a group of people who can work together to fix some of this stuff.
Well, thank you. I'm looking at doing some research with partners and through the Cass Business School and through the Workforce Institute of Europe that I've just joined. I do want to look at what the outcomes are on certain measurements of productivity, creativity, retention. I'd like to move the debate from well-being being about mental health fundamentally to including social health. And I am also now beginning personally to research a bit more the origins of modern connectedness. Why is it the lingua franca? Why is it that everybody does want to be connected? And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the science, the social science, and the social psychology really of why are we connected. Lieberman's work in UCLA is interesting in this regard.
You've been on the final question. You've been on the circuit a year. I always find with books
9 months.
Or 9 months, but you learn a lot when you're on the circuit in terms of talking about books. What have you learned about connectivity that you didn't know and you didn't put in the book that if you were writing it now you'd put in? Final question, and then we're done.
Well, I didn't know how fast the current would change. So AI and cognitive intelligence, I would have made much more dominant in the book. I would have thought about it more and learned more about it because I think that is a much more pressing concern than just what we feel as humans about connectedness, but it's now how connected the artificial intelligence is going to be, that we are going to work alongside. I think it was Mark Prensky who said to me last night, if two people can do the job, a robot will do it. So the abilities, the social connected abilities of individuals is going to be critical. I certainly learned that generally speaking, people are deeply worried about technology taking over. And they are worried about the loss of community and the invasion of community. You know, Facebook has got itself into some very sticky trouble because it has manipulated the communities with its feeds and with its algorithms. And I think people are concerned about that. My main hope is that we are having a broader, wider conversation. If anyone wants to read the book and stand me corrected on anything I've said, I'd be very happy to hear it. You know, I'm new to this game of putting ideas out there, and ideas are there to be challenged and expanded on.
And I think conversation is everything. I think you provided an extremely interesting introduction to this conversation about social health. So I want to thank Julia for her time and for the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.